Hi, I'm Miriam Cates. You're watching GB News Originals. Now, joining me today is an economist, Neil Record, who has some very difficult news about our economy. Neil Record, thank you so much for joining me on GB News Originals. Now, the big fiscal crisis, the black hole, whatever you want to call it, Rachel Reeves' upcoming budget is going to be a really, really important event. People are already speculating about the tax rises she might have to make, any cuts she might have to make, because underlying all this, the UK economy is not in a strong position, is it? We've got huge debt, budget deficit and interest costs that are spiralling out of control. What do you see as the key weaknesses of our current fiscal position?
Well, good question. I think there are many. Ones which I think are particularly difficult are what you might call obligations which we have already made, which are fully index linked and we can't get out of. Now, there's obviously normal debt. So what the government issues gilts, which is its standard debt. But there are two other obligations which are much less well understood. And we can talk about how much they are. And they are the state pension. And everyone sort of knows there's a state pension. But if you add up the promises we've made looking ahead from the contributions people have already made, these are numbers measured in trillions. That's the state pension. And the other one, much less well known, is unfunded public sector pensions. And I say unfunded because these are normal pensions in the old-fashioned way. So if you're a civil servant, if you're a teacher or work for the NHS or in the armed forces, the government says, we'll give you a pension. But to get that pension, you have to make employee contributions. Everyone's familiar with what that means. With the exception of armed forces, that's about 10% of pay a year. So it's really quite significant. What most of the employees don't know is the government also makes a payment. The employer makes a payment. This is rather bizarre because it makes payment actually to itself, but it does make a payment of between 20 and 30% of pay as well. So the highest of those, slightly less than 30%, the highest is the teachers' pension scheme, which is demanding 38% of pay as its total contribution. So about 10% from teachers and another 28.5% from employers. So you might imagine this is great because the contributions are going in and then the pensions are coming out, and you would be completely wrong. The contributions are going in because they are required to pay the pensions already promised of people already retired who made their contributions 20 or 30 years ago. So what's happened over the last, let's say, 40 or 50 years is the government has explicitly chosen to receive contributions from all of these employees and indeed itself that looks like they are contributions for pensions, but instead of saving them, which, by the way, companies are required by law to do, to put them in a pensions pot, they've spent them. The money has gone. It's billions and billions. In fact, it's trillions. It's gone. It's been spent. And it made every budget deficit in the last 30 years look a bit narrower, or every surplus look a bit better, because it looked like that income was tax income, and it wasn't. So we have built up an enormous obligation, and I'll talk about how much, in the last 20 or 30 years in unfunded public sector pensions. And under English law, these are commercial contracts between an employer and employee, and so the courts will defend them. So this isn't like...
Let's say a teacher retires and there's no longer, the contributions being made by current teachers is no longer enough to pay the pensions of all the teachers that have retired because life expectancy has increased so much. Nevertheless, there is an absolute legal requirement for the government to still pay those pensions, also would be. So the burden is on the current taxpayer.
Exactly. And the burden is increasingly on the current taxpayer. And just to give you a flavour of the size of the numbers, you're probably aware that there's argument in Parliament over 5 billion here and 10 billion there, which, in the government spends about 1,100 billion a year. So that's a lot. The pensions that are being paid out today on contributions that were made over the last 40 years by all these pensioners who retired in the public sector is £56.5 billion today. And the government has been, not just this Labour government, but all governments have been really bad at telling us what's going on because in the government accounts, they don't report that number. I mean, you can find it if you dig around a thing called the Public Expenditure Statistic Analysis, and official numbers. But what they do is they report the difference between today's contributions that today's employees and employers are making for future pensions and net that off against the 57 or so billion pounds which they're paying today. And that numbers are basically naught. So the amount that's being paid out today has been rising very rapidly. So only 3 or 4 years ago, it was less than 50 billion. It's been rising rapidly because of inflation and because people are retiring and living longer. So the contributions being required to keep that number close to naught have been going up very, very rapidly.
So these pensions are also guaranteed to rise by inflation. So in other words, each time
rising inflation, and they have no cap on them. So in the year when it's 2023, I think inflation was 10.1%. September CPI is the reference point for that, and then a year later, 6 months later, you get the rise. There was no cap; they got 10.1%. Whereas for, let's say, you worked for, I don't know, the BP or the BBC or a large, well-respected organisation that probably has legacy pensions, modern pensions, what's called defined contribution. You put your money in and you're at risk for all the money. But the old ones, there's lots of people on corporate pensions. Most of those have pension inflation caps, typically between either 5% or 3%. So in a year when there's very high inflation, they lose out. That their money is then worth less than it was. And none of that applies in the public sector. So we now have a situation where, looking ahead for the next 50 years, current taxpayers who don't have a public sector pension will be paying the pensions of people who do have a public sector pension, fully index linked, and those taxpayers also have to find a pension for themselves. So there's a double whammy for this generation. Now, this is so what to do about this particular problem? My recommendation to government, and I have given it to government who have looked at it very briefly a couple of years ago, would be to offer all public sector workers and it depends rather on what the actuaries say that the contribution should be worth, but let's say 30% of pay, offer them a 30% pay rise and say from now on, you're like all the private sector workers, make your own arrangements. So they would put probably 10 or 15% in a pension, and then the rest would be an actual pay rise because these pensions are very valuable. And my recommendation would be to make that optional, because I suspect that most employees would rather have the money now and not have to wait till they were 66 when they get the money.
And especially in the current climate for young people starting out in work, when they've got student debt, when house prices are so high, a 30% income boost would be pretty well.
Fantastic. So I did a quiz, as you do for these things, of a public sector worker. So my eldest son is a doctor. He's actually just become a consultant. He was a junior doctor. I said, okay, Chris, would you like a 30% pay rise and no future pension when you're 66? You've already got 10 years under your belt. And he said, what would you recommend? I said, don't take it, because actually they're worth more than that. They're probably worth 40 or 50% of pay. He said, no, Dad, I definitely take it. Now, that's a guy with a good degree. He understands maths. He knows what he's doing. So I can see that actually what's called the personal discount rate of most people is much, much higher than the discount rate than the cost of pensions. So they will say, no, I'd rather have the money now, because money in the future, 10 or 20 years time, I don't really value. And he said to me quite rightly, Dad, I'll have paid off my mortgage by then. I'll have a house, so I'll be able to manage to have the money now. So I think that will work. So as a way of getting rid of it, but so politically, it's probably survivable. You can probably make it option. You'll probably find 80% of people will take it, and then you're done. I think the real difficulty is from that moment, you have no more contributions coming in. So £57 billion appears as a cash hole in the government accounts. So that's why I think every government who's looked at this, and 15 years ago, David Cameron asked me to look at it for him. And they had the Hutton Review, which I contributed to, and they didn't make any changes because fiscally it's just too difficult.
Yes, and for 35, 40 years, the taxpayer is then fully on the hook for the pensions of those who are already retired until the new cohort comes through and retires.
So this is a sort of classic political problem. If you keep kicking the can down the road, the cans kind of pile up. And at some point, and this is a very specific one, and people say, oh, yeah, but it's a corner of the world. It's only 20% of employees. At its peak, when interest rates were at their lowest, the government itself valued this obligation as slightly more, at £2.8 trillion, slightly more than the national debt itself.
God.
That's now fallen because interest rates have risen. It's a complicated calculation, but it's still more than £1 trillion.
But nevertheless, this is a completely concrete obligation for future governments. There's absolutely no way of getting out of paying that debt.
So this is something that I've been banging on. I mean, I wrote a paper just under 20 years ago called Sir Humphrey's Legacy, for those of you who remember Yes Minister.
I do. It was wonderful.
Humphrey was a civil servant, and it was all about the legacy he's left. And I mean, everything I wrote then, people, one or two then of the shadow ministers, Conservative ministers, read it and said, this is really interesting, we should do something about it. But 20 years later, nothing has been done. So that's public sector pensions. So the state pension is very different, because the state pension is not an employer-employee contract. The courts will not enforce any particular promise. What we have there is, instead of having 5.5 million people, we have essentially every person who has any NI contributions, which is probably 35 million people, are promised about £230 a week. And that's much, much more overall than the promise to all their much higher pensions, the promise to only 5.5 million people. And that is also index linked. And as we famously know, it's not just index linked to earnings or to prices, it's index linked to the higher of earnings, prices, and 2.5%. So at the moment, it's in lockstep to guaranteed to give pensioners more than workers are getting every year, because they'll either get the same, or in the years when those either prices or 2.5% kick in, they'll get more. And I've just looked at, ever since this has been going, it started in 2013, the triple lock, the pensioners have got nearly 1% more per year than workers. This is morally and financially unsustainable. You shouldn't be offering pensioners more higher increase than workers get. So again, this needs major reform. And here the government can do that. There are no legal constraints, but there are clearly heavy political constraints.
Now, you've outlined some very sensible economic solutions to something that seems to me an almost crisis level problem. But the politics of this are so difficult. And I think there are several reasons for that. Firstly, governments have misrepresented to people for a couple of generations now how the state pension works. And lots of people think that their national insurance contributions have gone into a pot with their name on, and that they are drawing from that pot that they pay for out of their earnings, their hard-earned income. And so if you tell people, actually, do you know what? We can't afford the state pension anymore. We're going to cut it, or we're going to end the triple lot. We're going to means test it. They quite rightly think that they are being
wrong.
Exactly. So before we can do anything about this, we have to change the minds of literally millions of people about how the pension works. And then the second problem that we have is that when these pensions were designed, back in the 40s and 50s really, life expectancy was between 65 and 70. Even if you did live to retirement, you were probably only going to draw your pension for 5 years. And the calculation of how much current taxpayers should be contributing was made on that basis. We've now got a completely different landscape where you might well be retired for 20 years or more. And really, it's impossible to think that any future taxpayer will be able to fund that kind of retirement. So how do we untangle this political mess before it's too late, like we see in France, riots today over this very issue?
Super good questions. And finally, if the continent have got even worse problems on this than we have, but let's just stick to it. So you're absolutely right. In the original design of the state pension in the 40s, early 50s, there was actually a thing called the National Insurance Fund. It was actually a proper bank account, and money actually went in from national insurance to there. So the contributions were saved. But of course, it's the nature of government. There's no one to audit or check that they're following their own rules, and so they start sneaking money out. And for practical purposes now, all that money, as you say, has been spent. And even interestingly, with the state pension, even though it is what's called a contributory pension, and it's true that Cates and Record will have our record at the Department of Work and Pensions, and you look yourself up and they say, well done, you've got 21 years of contributions. And I just looked up mine, I'm now in my 70s, and I've got 40 something years of contribution. So I've fully, with more than 35 years, you get a full pension. But it's actually what's called a flat rate pension. So It's just a marker. It's binary. If you pay your national insurance for a year, then that's a qualifying year. If you have 35 qualifying years, it doesn't matter how much you earned, you will get the same pension.
So you might have paid millions in national insurance contribution if you're a very high earner, or hardly any if you're self-employed and not earning very much, but you get the same.
So it is already another one of the mechanisms by which we have a movement towards equality of earnings and income, along with the tax system, because, as I say, it's a flat rate system. But the fact it's contributory, as you say, leads everyone to think, I paid my national insurance, it's my money. But in law, it's not. So I think you're right on this one, that the government has really got to start on a massive campaign to say, I'm so sorry, but all our predecessors spent the money. There isn't a national insurance fund. It's gone. In fact, there aren't any funds. So all this idea of a national wealth fund, you probably know the new government has just formed one. They borrowed the money to do that. I mean, there isn't. We're borrowing money to create money. I mean, this is all not. Real money, unfortunately, has to be saved with real surpluses. And in the last 50 years, we've only had 2 years where there was a government surplus, and that was under Blair. For various reasons, he had a very good time. And we've been running deficits every year since then. And so all we are doing is piling on new debt. Quite a lot of our debt, this is just our standard debt, which is now about £2.6 trillion. Quite a lot is long-term debt at fixed rates, not inflation-linked. Fine, so if we have inflation, that will erode. But unfortunately, there are 2 other sorts of debt which are not like that. One is about 650 billion is held at the Bank of England, and that's borrowed at short-term interest rates, currently 4%. But if interest rates go up, we have to pay more and the other is index-linked gilts, which are exactly like the pensions we were talking about. That is, if inflation goes up, these get more expensive as well. And I've actually just been re-looking at the interest cost that we're paying. So the government claims we pay 120 billion a year in interest, which is, by the way, a record. But it's wrong. We don't pay 120, we pay just under 170 billion. Because, and this is again all part of this is government sort of constantly twisting and turning to keep the population unfamiliar with what's going on. The rules require that if you have a government-sponsored funded pension scheme, it's got to recognise that if it isn't fully funded, then there's an interest cost to having not put your money away. And the government has picked, I'm afraid this is a bit technical, the government accounting system, a European one, which means that our local government pension scheme, which by the way is different, separate and additional to the unfunded one, which is funded, has an interest cost because the obligations are going up because of the passage of time. And that's about £17 billion, 18 billion, which I think is fully offset by the fact we have put some money aside in local government, about 400 billion. So those two match. So I strip that out. So it's paying in gilts about 102, 103 billion pounds. But if you put in this unfunded pension scheme, which the government has taken a specific accounting mechanism which allows them not to include it, but the reality is it is included because it's a government HM Treasury guarantee to these unfunded civil servants and teachers. The interest, what's called the unwinding of the discount rate, or the money borrowed because you didn't invest it, is 67 billion pounds this year. So add all that up, it's 170 billion is the interest we're paying this year. This is really close to meltdown. This is an enormous amount.
It puts it nearly at the highest amount of government spending above almost all other departments.
NHS is 170 billion. I mean, it's just about the same. So we're spending as much on interest as we are on the NHS. And defence, to give you a flavour, defence is 55 billion.
Yes.
So, I mean, this cannot go on. And of course, the government's allowed it to get to this point where there probably will be a crisis.
But we say it can't go on. But what are the consequences if it did? Because this seems to be the problem, particularly, again, I'll talk about France because this is very current news. I mean, the French government has just fallen because the Prime Minister is unable to persuade enough politicians to reduce debt. But there seems to be this view that one or two things people say. Either, well, if the government just cut a bit more waste. Let's cut benefits a bit. Let's stop wasting a bit of money on the civil service. Let's stop foreign aid. Then we could sort this out. But I think, that completely underestimates the difference in scale between those two things. Or they say, well, we're issuing debt in our own currency. This debt can be endless. We never have to pay it back. Look at Japan. They've got a 250% debt to GDP ratio. We can just keep spending the money. That seems to be what the French are thinking. Anyway, what happens if we don't sort this out?
Yeah, well, the French have a particular problem because they aren't borrowing in their own currency. So I would say the French is not like us because ultimately they're borrowing at a currency run by, Germany and the low interest countries, and they could default. It's feasible to think that. We won't default. That is, we won't refuse to pay, but the markets may just keep looking at us and say, we just don't trust this government to behave sensibly. We think our investments are at risk. We think there's a chance this will lead to inflation. We will keep on asking for more interest. And at the moment, as you know, in the long-dated gilt, so if you're borrowing money for 30 or 40 years, we're paying 5.5%. Now, if you think that's a lot, I'm old enough to remember the last time we had very high inflation, which was in the mid-70s. And the government then issued a 20-year gilt, and she's borrowing money for 20 years at a fixed interest rate of 15.5%. So imagine if we had to get to so interest rates can get there and have done for the British government, a AAA, a gilt-edged borrower. So it didn't default, but effectively for overseas investors who are the people who are funding us, high inflation erodes the value of what they invest in, so they want a compensation for that in high interest rates. So it could get a lot worse. So we think 5.5% is high, but maybe it's 6 or 7 or 8 or 9. My assessment, if we get to 10%, I think we will be in proper political crisis mode, and 10% interest rates is not out of the question.
So Neil, if you were Chancellor, the $1 million question, what would you do, given that you've got to operate within the realms of political possibility? This is a democracy. You can easily be ousted if your party, if the government, if the country don't like what you do. What steps do you think could be taken feasibly to start to get a grip on this?
We have reached, I think, and it's evident in the poor Chancellor, Mrs. Reeves, is really struggling to raise more tax money. She's going to try, but I think a thing called the Laffer curve, which will kick in, which is that as you get rates too high, people stop doing that thing. They do something else. So we probably won't raise more than 38 or 39% of GDP per taxes. We never have before. We probably won't. We're spending 45% of GDP. We've got to get that down to 38% of GDP or lower to cover all this, to start resaving. We can't change our public sector pension obligations. We probably shouldn't change our state pension obligations. That leaves a whole range of things we're spending money on, which we are going to have to spend less or no money. And that includes universal credit, the PIPs. I mean, these are now, those two together are probably 100, 120 billion. I mean, these are very, very large numbers indeed. So that would help you quite a lot. Remember, 100 billion is about 4% of GDP, so we've got a long way to go. And I think there is a very strong case to have a fundamental reform of the NHS. I don't think it'll cost less, but I think if you reform it, you may find the efficiencies then feed through into a much better performing health service, which may allow us to have growth in other areas. And that's probably going to an Australian system where the government still pays, but instead of it coming from the top down, it comes from patients who effectively have their own government money to spend. So that would be, but essentially this is a welfare problem. We are going to have to significantly dismantle the scale of the welfare state for us to be able to get back to having enough money to be able to carry on, to be sustainable.
And do you think that it would be feasible to means test the state pension? Because it is a benefit, as we've already discussed, like universal credit. People don't see it like that, but nevertheless, it is. You've paid your tax and you get given it from current taxpayers' contributions. Could you means test it, or would that just introduce perverse incentives where people wouldn't save for their own retirement because they'd know that if they were poor enough, they get the state pension?
There already are perverse incentives, because if you don't have contributions, you go into a thing called pension credit, which is actually quite similar to state pension. But yes, politically, that's probably a doable option. My favourite is actually completely different, which is that I believe we should abandon the triple lock. We should have our state pension linked only to prices, but it should be linked to earnings until you retire. So actually, different cohorts of retirees would have different pensions. That's just exactly the way that private DB pensions work. So earnings until you retire and then prices. But I would give people in their 60s a much lower pension than today because they can still work, do bits of part-time, they can manage, and have it rise by age until in your 80s. It was really pretty generous, much more than the £230 a week it is today, because in your 80s you need it. But with that pivot, you could then find that actually you could, in practice but not in law, you could make the retirement age push right, because at the moment it's 66, it will be going to 68. And I think you should probably get something then, but I would have it much less than the amount they're getting at the moment. And that's big numbers. You could take 20, 30, 40 billion off the costs. So all of these things, but that requires, brave thinking, radical thinking. And I have seen nothing from that, to be honest, from either this government or the previous one.
Do you think there is potentially another political problem brewing in intergenerational warfare over this, as young people increasingly realise that their huge tax contributions are going to pay for benefits that they are never going to receive when they get to retirement age? And you've even seen the French Prime Minister mention this in his speech, that older French people are almost enslaving younger French people to the workforce for longer.
And the feeling is, I think, quite familiar in the UK. I think funny enough, us economists spotted this. So I'm a founder of and funder of a think tank called Intergenerational Foundation, because it's interested in exactly these questions. They are on things like debt. So we didn't used to have governments that could raise this scale of debt. But I mean, it's 100% of GDP, and it's going to be paid by future taxpayers, not the current ones who've taken the money. The housing crisis, which is now, the housing stock is largely owned by very old people. And pensions, which are unfunded. If you fund them, it's fine, because then you have assets which move across the generations. And governments, I'm afraid, have consistently, not just this one, but across the piece, democratic governments, have favoured current expenditure over planning for the future. And so they keep on giving it to the current voters, forgetting about the future. And this, I mean, it's just really bad behaviour. And I understand it, because that your incentives, if you're Prime Minister, lie in being elected next time. But it does mean, I'm afraid, we've got ourselves really in this very, very difficult position. And there aren't there are no easy, nice, simple solutions, no magic wand. This is going to be painful.
Yeah. Very sad, very true. But Neil Record, such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for unpacking all that. I think it's just so important that we fully understand what's going on here, because tough decisions are going to have to be made. Neil Record, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Miriam. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Well, that was the economist Neil Record with some very difficult truths about the state of the British economy. Well, don't forget to like and subscribe below. This is GB News Originals. And also don't forget to download our GB News app.